Hi, welcome to StatStuff. I'm Matt Hansen. In this lesson, we'll review the project scope. The scope of a project is easy to overlook or take for granted, but there's a lot of value in clearly defining it up front. We'll discuss what the scope is and how to build it. We'll be talking briefly about problem statements, so it may be helpful to review the lesson on building a problem statement before viewing this one. So let's begin this lesson by defining what the project scope is. Well, project scope defines the boundaries of the project. It basically shows what the project should focus on, that is the things that should be included, as well as the things that it shouldn't focus on, that is the things that should be excluded from the project. So just like on a rifle that you're trying to shoot, the scope that you would put on a rifle helps you aim at the target so you can be more confident and ensure that you're actually hitting the target for which you're aiming. So what's the purpose of the project scope? Well, one of the purposes is to remind and unify the team about what the specific problem is that they're trying to fix. It's a way to keep the project at a manageable level, that is where it's not getting too big or even it's not too small either. And it's a way to prevent the project from drifting in the wrong direction and focusing on the wrong target, because we don't want the scope to change too easily. So how do you define the scope? Well, always start with the project sponsor. When you meet with the sponsor for the first time and you're trying to define the problem from their perspective, also ask them what they believe should be in or out of scope for the particular project. Also try to verify the scope with the rest of the team as well. The team can probably be very helpful in giving you the details about the things that need to be included or excluded from the project. The scope should also complement the background and the problem statements. Again, those pain points and the symptoms that you're trying to improve in the first place within the project. So you'd use the background and problem statements to prompt other types of questions that could help narrow and expand the scope that you should have for your project. And finally, you want to validate the scope that you've built with the sponsor and the entire team, because you want to make sure that everyone agrees to it. Many people have trouble defining what the appropriate size is for defining a project scope. So let's talk a little bit about some tips on how to size the scope. So how do we know what's the right size for the project scope that we're trying to define? Well, the project scope can really influence the duration of the entire project. If you have a scope that's too big, then it can make the project take far too long, and the team can easily lose momentum. But at the same time, if the scope is too small, then it can make the project go too fast, almost to the point where the results from the project seem like they're irrelevant. So aim for a scope that will get the project done in about 3 to 6 months. That might be the ideal time to aim for. But you have to be careful when you make those kinds of estimates. Projects can very often take 50% longer than what you originally estimated. So if you're aiming for maybe 6 months, then aim for a scope that you think might take you about 4 months to accomplish, because chances are it could easily extend to 5 or 6 months there. The findings in the project pre-assessment, if you've done one, that could help reveal also any ideal level of scope that you might need for the project. So gauge the project scope by the resources that you're actually going to be needing. If you need many different resources from many different areas, chances are the scope may be too big to the point where it might feel like you're trying to boil the ocean. But if you're the only one that's needed to accomplish the entire project, chances are the scope may be too small. So it's easier to expand the scope than it is to shrink it. So if you're in a doubt as far as how big to make the scope, I would recommend that you work with your sponsor about making the scope a little bit smaller than what you might expect, because then as you approach it and dig in and research it, then you might find that you can expand it from there. It's far easier to do that than to start off too big and trying to drill it down, because you might get the impression as if you're not accomplishing exactly what the customer, or in this case the sponsor, is really wanting you to accomplish. Also, look for logical groups or divisions within the business area. That is, you might find that there are certain logical groups, like in the business for locations or customer types or different ways that are reported, that might break into those different groups. Those different groups might represent logical breakouts between how you might scope something. That is, you might scope it only to certain types of groups, certain types of locations or types of customers. So those can present some good areas of how you might scope it down. Now, how do you handle if you get any scope creep, or how do you avoid any type of scope creep? Well, the requests that come in for expanding the scope, it's not uncommon to get those kinds of requests. So when you have those kinds of requests, make sure you use the project charter where you identify the scope as a reminder that, hey, this is the actual scope we originally agreed to. Let's not get off track here and take on more than what we originally agreed to set out to do. because you got to remember that scope affects risk. If you're increasing the project scope, well, that could also increase the risk of failure in your project. So you have to really take that into consideration before you too easily expand the scope. So validate any scope change that gets recommended. Validate those changes with the entire team, especially with the sponsor, and make them fully aware of the impact and risk potentially of project failure if you make that scope too big. All right, before we close this lesson, let's discuss how we can apply some of these concepts in a practical way. What I'd like you to do is identify at least 3 different projects or initiatives or issues that you might have worked in your own organization, and ask yourself some of these questions for each one. For example, what were the parameters that were defined for each one of those different projects? That is, what items like the customer type or region or locations or timeframes or departments, those different kinds of categories, what were those items that were specifically included or excluded for each of those different projects? Now, did those parameters, those that were defined as part of the scope, did those things change before the project actually ended? If they did change, then ask yourself these questions. Why did the scope change? And was it a necessary change? That is, was it something that made it better as a result of the change? And if it wasn't, then who allowed for the change and why was that change allowed? And what effect did that change have on the overall project? In other words, did it delay the project? Did it cost more money or more time or resources that were involved? Did it increase the risk level to some degree? And what could have been done differently at the beginning of the project to have anticipated that scope change and accounted for it much sooner than when it occurred? Well, that wraps up this lesson. Check out StatStuff.com for many more resources that can help you achieve powerful results. I'm Matt Hansen. Thanks for watching.